They called it the offering. Such a soft word for what it was. A gentle word. The kind you might use for flowers left at a grave or coins pressed into a beggar's palm. But in the northern kingdom of Valemore, the offering meant something else. It meant a girl in white. It meant a night that never reached morning. It meant 17 weddings and 17 funerals and no one in between who lived to tell the difference. 17 brides, 17 graves. And every one of them had walked into the Winter King's chamber warm and been carried out cold. Eloin knew the number by heart. Everyone did. Children in Valemore learned it the way they learned their prayers whispered under blankets when the wind screamed down from the mountains. 17 women, 17 hearts that had simply stopped in the dark, frozen from the inside out, as though winter itself had reached into their chests and closed its fist. And now they wanted an 18th. She stood in the line with the others. 6 girls beside her, scrubbed and perfumed and dressed in white so pure it hurt the eyes. White in the north was not the color of brides. White was the color of what you buried. Everyone in that great hall understood the joke and no one dared laugh. The girl to her left was weeping, quietly. The kind of crying that has learned to make no sound because sound invites attention, and attention was the last thing any of them wanted tonight. She was older than the rest, perhaps 30, still lovely in the way a candle is lovely just before it gutters. Powder had been pressed carefully beneath her eyes to hide the shadows, and it was failing. Eloin did not weep. She had forgotten how. Because somewhere along the way, in a childhood she could no longer fully remember, something had been taken out of her, scooped clean, hollowed. And what remained was a girl who could stand in a line of the doomed and feel nothing at all. Not fear, not grief, not even the small animal urge to run. She pressed one hand flat against her chest over the place where the fabric of her gown lay thickest, where the extra layers had been stitched in, where the mark was, the hollow mark. No one could see it. That was the point. It had been hidden since she was a child, buried under cloth and shame, a scar shaped like an absence right over her heart. A brand that had drained her of everything worth taking and left behind a girl who was by every measure that mattered to her father already dead. Which was exactly why she was here. Because her father had looked at his 2 daughters and made a choice. One of them was gold, one of them was ash. And when the king's men came asking for a bride, Lord Aldrich of House Corrin had not hesitated for even the length of a breath. "You're already broken," he'd told her in the carriage, not looking at her face. "At least this way you're worth something. Damaged goods, offered up. So the family might gain and lose nothing they valued." She thought about that now, standing 5th in a line of 7, and waited for the anger to come. It didn't. It never did anymore. The whispers moved through the watching crowd like wind through dead grass. I heard the last one screamed. Screamed until she couldn't. They found scratch marks on the door, where she tried to get out. No, no, they said she went peaceful. Peaceful as sleeping. Peaceful. A low, ugly laugh. That's what we're calling it now. Eloin kept her eyes on the floor, on the great flagstones worn smooth by centuries of feet. She had learned long ago that fear only fed the cruel, and that the surest way to be left alone was to give them nothing to feast on. So she gave them nothing. She stood very still, and she waited, and she wondered with a strange, distant curiosity, the way you might wonder about weather in a country you'd never visit, whether it would hurt. Whether anything could hurt a girl who was already empty. And then the doors at the far end of the hall came open. Not gently. They crashed, both at once flung wide by unseen hands, and every voice in that vast room died in the same instant as if a single throat had been cut. The Winter King had come. He walked in like something the cold had made, and then set loose upon the world. Tall, impossibly, almost cruelly tall, with shoulders built to fill a doorway, and dark hair black as a raven's wing falling loose past the sharp line of his jaw. He wore black, only black. And where he passed the very torches seemed to lean away, but it was his eyes that stopped the hall's heart. Pale, gray, the gray of a frozen lake in the moment before the ice gives way. The gray of the last breath fogging in the air. He swept that gaze down the line of trembling girls, and Eloan watched from the corner of her downcast eyes as one by one they flinched beneath it. One girl's knees simply gave out. Guards lunged to catch her before she struck the stone. The king did not so much as glance at her, because there was nothing in his face. That was the terrible thing. Not hunger, not malice, not even boredom. Just a vast, worn-out emptiness, the look of a man who had watched 17 women die in his bed and expected the 18th to be no different. He knows Eloan thought with that same distant clarity. He knows exactly what's going to happen to whichever one of us he chooses. And he's going to choose anyway. His boots came down against the stone, slow, deliberate, each step a small thunder in the silence. First girl. He stopped. Eloan heard the poor thing's breath tear ragged in her throat. Then his boots moved on. Second, third, fourth, and then the footsteps stopped directly in front of her. She did not look up. She looked at his boots, fine black leather salt-stained at the toe. She looked at the hem of his coat. She felt his attention settle over her like a weight, like a hand pressing down on her shoulders, on her chest, on the hidden mark above her hollow heart. The silence went on so long it began to scream. "Look at me." His voice, low, cold. And underneath the cold, she caught it faint as a heartbeat through a wall, something that sounded almost like exhaustion. She raised her eyes. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. He studied her face with an intensity that should have frightened her, that had frightened every girl before her. His gaze searched for something. Fear, maybe. The particular music of a woman's terror he must have heard 17 times already. She had nothing to give him, because her heart was already empty. Her family had already thrown her away. Death, if it came tonight, would only be finishing work that had begun a long time ago. And perhaps he saw that. Perhaps he saw the absence where fear should have lived, the strange flat calm in a girl who had run out of things to lose, because something shifted in his face, just barely, the smallest crack in a wall of ice. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eloan." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Your Majesty." "Eloan." He said it slowly, turned it over as though tasting it. "And you're not afraid?" It wasn't a question. "No, Your Majesty." Why? She could have told him the truth. Because I have nothing left to take. Because I've been dead inside for years and no one noticed. Because whatever curse froze those women can't touch a girl who's already hollow. She said none of it. Instead, she held his gaze, and she spoke a truth that surprised even her. "Because I don't think you want to." The hall gasped. Somewhere behind her, someone dropped something metal, and it rang against the stone like a struck bell. The king's eyes widened just a fraction, just enough to see. And then slowly something crossed his face that might in another man have been the ghost of a smile. "This one," he said, and the whole world tilted. "I'll take this one." Chaos broke behind them. Eloan barely heard it, because she was watching his hand. He had begun to reach toward her and then stopped, caught himself. His fingers curled back, and she saw in that pale hand the smallest tremor. He didn't want to touch her. No. She understood it all at once with the clarity of cold water. It wasn't that he didn't want to. He was afraid to. The deadliest king in 3 centuries. The man who had frozen 17 women in the dark. And he was afraid of what would happen when his skin met hers. She filed that away. A small, strange fact. And she let the guards lead her out of the Hall of the Dead into the night, toward whatever waited. The carriage moved through the dark in silence. She sat across from him, close enough to feel it, the cold that poured off him, unnatural and steady, seeping through the velvet cushions and the white of her gown, and settling into her bones like fog off a winter river. Any other girl would have shivered. She welcomed it. The cold was honest. The cold made no promises it didn't mean to keep. "You'll be given chambers," he said at last, still watching the black window. "Servants, you'll want for nothing." "Until I die," she said. His jaw tightened. "Until the night is through." "And if I live to see the morning?" The question hung there in the cold air between them, and for the first time he turned and looked at her fully. In the swaying lamplight, His face seemed carved from something harder than flesh, beautiful and remote and terribly, terribly tired. "No one lives to see the morning," he said. "I thought you understood what you'd agreed to." "I understood." "Then why?" And here his voice did something she hadn't expected. It cracked, just slightly. The first hairline fracture in all that ice. "Why did you not tremble like the others? Why did you look at me as if—" He stopped himself. "As if what, Your Majesty?" He turned back to the window. Several heartbeats passed before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had dropped so low she had to lean toward the cold to hear it. 17 women, he murmured. 17 have shared my bed since the curse took hold. Everyone dead before the dawn." His hands closed slowly on his knees. Some went quietly, some fought, some begged, none of them lived. She absorbed this the way she absorbed everything now, without flinching, without weeping. But somewhere beneath the hollow something stirred, not fear, but a strange aching recognition. Because she knew what it was to carry something inside you that killed the warmth in every room you entered. "Why do you keep trying?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What, if you know they'll die, why keep taking brides? Why not just stay alone?" For a long moment he said nothing, and when he answered it was barely more than breath. "Because the curse grows stronger the longer I resist it. Because without someone to anchor me, I'll lose myself entirely. And because—" His throat worked. "Because I am still fool enough to hope that someday someone will be strong enough to live." She looked at him then, truly looked. This man the whole realm called a monster. This man whose own guards flinched when he passed. This man who radiated cold because something was slowly, patiently freezing him from the inside. And she saw his loneliness. She recognized it, because it was the twin of her own. "I can't promise I'll live," she said quietly. "But I can promise I won't beg. I won't scream. Whatever comes tonight, I'll meet it standing up." He turned to face her fully. And in those winter eyes, she saw something that looked almost like gratitude. "That," he said, "is more than any woman has ever offered me." The carriage slowed. Beyond the glass, the castle of Valemore rose against the moon, black towers and frozen battlements waiting like a held breath. He stepped down first, then turned, and offered her his hand. She looked at it, and she took it. His skin was ice, colder than winter, colder than stone, cold enough that her fingers should have gone numb the instant they touched him, cold enough to stop a heart. But instead, where their hands met, warmth bloomed. Small, faint, but unmistakable. A little spark of heat right there in the place their skin touched, spreading like the first thaw of spring across frozen ground. The king went utterly still. His grip tightened without his meaning it to. His eyes dropped to their joined hands, and something moved across his face she had not seen there before. Not the ghost of a smile. Not exhaustion. Wonder. And beneath the wonder, fear. "That's impossible," he whispered. "They signed the contract at dawn. A bitter little joke that. Dawn, the hour she was never meant to see. They dragged it out before the sun had properly risen in the great council chamber beneath tapestries stitched with all the bloody history of Valemore. 7 advisors sat along the long table. 7 pairs of eyes ranging from cold curiosity to open disgust. And at the far end, in the seat of highest honor, sat her father. Lord Aldrich of House Corran did not look at her. I had not looked at her since the carriage that carried her here, when he'd explained in that flat and reasonable voice exactly why she was being given away. Beside him sat her sister. Marin. Golden Marin. Unmarked, unbroken, everything Elowen was not. And she was staring at Elowen now with an expression that would not settle into any single thing. Something torn, something guilty, something that might in a different sister have been grief. "The terms are simple," the eldest advisor read. "Lady Elowen of House Corran shall serve as bride to His Majesty King Caelan for the span of 1 night. Should she survive until dawn, the marriage is made whole and she shall be crowned queen. Should she not—" He paused, cleared his throat. "The usual arrangements shall be made." The usual arrangements. Such clean words for a grave. Are these terms agreeable, Lady Elowin? But before she could answer, her father spoke. I must register a concern. His voice dripped false regret. Elowin's stomach turned to stone. My daughter is not well. She carries a mark, an illness. I should hate for His Majesty to blame House Corrin should she prove too weak to last the night. He was doing it. He was going to expose her. The hollow mark, the secret she had buried her whole life, he would drag it into the light in front of them all, to shield himself from blame for her death. What mark? Said King Kalin. His voice cut the room like a blade drawn across ice. Her father smiled thin as a wire. Perhaps my daughter might show you herself, before you bind yourself to this. Every eye in the chamber turned to her, and her hollow heart empty as it was still found the strength to slam against her ribs. The lady's health, said the king before she could move, is not relevant to this contract. She agreed to the terms. That is enough. But your majesty, I said it is enough. The temperature in the room fell like a stone down a well. Frost crept visible and sudden along the edges of the tall windows. Two advisors shrank back in their chairs. Elowin watched her breath begin to fog in the air. Or do you question my judgment? Lord Corrin. Her father's smile broke apart. Of course not, your majesty. Good. And then the king turned to her. And for just a moment, a single-held moment, something in his hard face gentled. Sign, he said. She crossed to the table on legs that did not want to hold her. She took the quill, dipped it, and wrote her name in ink the color of old blood. He signed after her, his signature sharp and slashing like something carved rather than written. It is done, the eldest advisor said. May the gods have mercy. No one said on whom. The council filed out, her father among them still without a backward glance. But Myron stayed. Marin, who followed her into the corridor, who caught her by the alcove near the servant's stair, who glanced twice over her shoulder before she spoke. There's something you need to know. Her voice was low, urgent, frightened. About the king, about his curse. Elowin waited. The women, they don't just die. Marin's words tumbled out now, spilling faster than she could catch them. He drains them. Not on purpose. But the curse feeds. On warmth. On life. On... She swallowed. On love. I don't understand. The more a woman comes to care for him, the faster the curse takes her. Marin's fingers closed hard around her arm. The ones who lasted longest were the ones who felt nothing. Do you understand me? And the ones who died fastest. Her voice broke apart. Were the ones who started to fall for him. Elowin stood very still in the cold corridor. Why are you telling me this? Because I saw how he looked at you. Something bright and terrible stood in Marin's eyes. And I saw how you looked at him. There was something there. A recognition. She released Elowin's arm as if it had burned her. If you let yourself feel anything for that man, you will not last the night. I don't feel, Elowin said, flat, certain. Not anymore. Everyone feels something, eventually. Marin stepped back. Her golden hair caught the gray dawn light. Father sent you here to die. I know that, but She stopped. Her jaw worked. I don't want that. Whatever's between us, whatever he made us into, I don't want you dead. Elowin searched her sister's face for the trap, the cruelty, the old familiar knife. She found none. Only a girl she used to know from a childhood. Neither of them talked about looking at her with something that had no name. Then wish me luck, Elowin said. There is no luck with him. Marin's voice followed her down the corridor, soft and heavy as falling snow. There's only the cold, and the cold always wins. They held the ceremony at twilight. The dying light poured through the cathedral's high windows, staining the stone floor in colors like bruises. Elowin walked the aisle alone. No father to give her away. No family in the pews, save Marin sitting rigid in the very back row, her face pale as candle wax. The rest of the seats were full of nobles, but they had not come to celebrate. They had come to watch, to see how another tragedy would unfold. to place their quiet bets perhaps on how many hours the plain little Corin girl would last. Their whispers followed her up the aisle like the hiss of dead leaves. She's plain. Not even lovely enough for a proper funeral. The last one lasted 4 hours. This one looks half in the grave already. She kept her eyes forward. On the altar. On the man who waited there. He wore black as always. But something in him had changed since the hall. There was a tension in his shoulders now. A tightness around his eyes that spoke of a night without sleep, of prayers offered up to gods who did not answer. He doesn't want to do this, she realized. He was as much a prisoner of this altar as she was. The priest began the rites in a voice that shook. He rushed the words as if speed might somehow lessen the weight of what he was blessing. Do you, Caelan, king of Valemore, take this woman as your bride, your queen, your mate? I do. His voice was steady. His hands at his sides were not. She saw them tremble. And do you, Elowin of House Corin, take this man as your husband, your king, your mate? She looked at him. At the curse made flesh. At the man who had killed 17 women simply by letting them close. I do. The priest swallowed. Then by the power granted me I pronounce, wait. The king's voice cracked across the cathedral like ice giving way beneath a foot. Everyone froze. The priest's mouth hung open around the unfinished word. In the pews the nobles leaned forward as one hungry scenting drama. Caelan reached into his coat and drew out something small. Metal. It caught the last of the light and threw it back. A ring. But not an ordinary ring. This one was forged from silver so pale it was nearly white and set with a single stone that seemed to hold captured frost inside it, a swirl of white cold trapped in glass. This was my mother's, he said, and his eyes never once left Elowin's face. She was the last woman to survive a full year at my father's side, before the curse took her too. A murmur ran through the crowd. The king never spoke of his mother. Never. She made me promise, he went on quieter now, that I would give this ring to no one. No one except a woman who could look at me without fear. A woman who might see the man beneath the monster. He took her hand. The cold of him struck her like a slap bone-deep familiar now. But under it there again. That impossible bloom of warmth where their skin met. You are the first, he said. For her ears alone. The first to look at me as though I were still a man. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. And the moment it settled against her skin, the frost trapped inside the stone began to move, to swirl, slow and deliberate, as if something inside it had, after a very long sleep, opened its eyes. Now, Caelan said to the priest, finish it. The priest stammered through the final blessing. The nobles broke into confused, uncertain applause, and through all of it, Elowin stood frozen at the altar staring at the pale ring on her finger, at the frost turning slowly within the stone. His mother's ring, given to no bride before her. Either it was a last kindness before her death, or something had changed, and she could not have said which of those frightened her more. The night came as nights do whether you are ready or not. They walked to his chambers through corridors lit by guttering torches, and with every step the air grew colder, and with every step Elowin felt the weight of 17 ghosts gathering at her back. At the door he stopped. You can still refuse, he said quietly. I can have you taken to another wing. You would live, at least until morning. We could... No. She met his eyes. I made a vow. I mean to keep it. Something crossed his face. Pain, perhaps, or hope, or the impossible marriage of the two. He opened the door. The room beyond was vast and cold, and dominated by a great bed draped in white linen. Frost had crept along the windows, silver and delicate, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. The very air seemed to crystallize as they stepped inside, each breath hanging visible and bright. Elowin, he said her name, and it broke in the middle. I'm sorry. For whatever comes next, I am sorry. She turned to face him. This monster. This lonely, freezing man. Don't apologize, she said. Not yet. The night isn't over. And then she did something that no bride before her had dared. She reached up, and she laid her hand against his face. The cold was staggering. Her fingers should have frozen against his skin, should have gone numb, then blue, then still. Instead, that warmth, that impossible warmth blooming out from her palm, sinking into him, spreading across his cheek like sunlight breaking over a frozen field. Kalen's breath caught in his throat. His eyes went wide, and for one impossible instant, she would swear it later to herself. In the dark, she saw color return to those pale, bloodless cheeks. A flush of living warmth there and then gone. He stared at her as though she were something he had stopped believing in. How he whispered, "Are you not dying?" She didn't know. She only knew that in the hollow place where her heart should have been, the empty place, the dead place, the place her father had called broken, and her whole life had called worthless something, for the very first time in years had begun to stir. And outside, unnoticed by either of them, the frost on the windows had already begun very slowly to melt. She woke to gray light and the impossible fact of her own breathing. For a long moment she simply lay there, unwilling to move, unwilling to test it, because if she moved the dream might break. And this had to be a dream. The fire had burned down to embers in the hearth. Frost laced the edges of the windows in silver ferns. Her breath still fogged in the cold air above the bed, but her heart was beating, slow, steady, alive. She had lived to see the dawn. Beside her, the Winter King lay still as carved stone, his dark hair spilled across the pillow like ink across parchment. His face, so sharp, so forbidding when he was awake, had softened in sleep into something almost young. His arm lay across her waist. Even asleep, he held her as though some part of him feared she might dissolve the moment he let go. She watched him and she remembered, because she had been afraid in the end, despite all her brave words. When he had first bent to kiss her, his lips cold as river stone. She had felt the curse move, a pulling deep in her chest, as if something had reached inside her and begun gently to draw the life out through her ribs. And then the pulling stopped. Not because the curse relented, but because it found nothing to take. It reached for her warmth, for her love, for the great blazing furnace of feeling that lived in ordinary women, and it found only the hollow, the mark, the empty room where her heart should have been. The curse had come to feast, and found the table bare. Where she touched him, warmth bloomed. Where she pressed her palm to his chest, the ice drew back, as though her emptiness were not a void at all but a vessel, a cup. Something hollow, yes, but hollow the way a bowl is hollow, waiting to be filled. And something in him had begun very slowly to fill it. He stirred. His eyes opened pale gray, catching the dawn, and found her face. And she watched the moment the truth reached him. Watched it land. Watched his whole body go rigid with a disbelief so total it looked almost like pain. He sat up so fast the bed frame groaned. Eloan. Her name tore out of him raw. His hands came up to cup her face, cradling it as if it might shatter in his grip. You're alive." "I lived," she said softly. "How?" It wasn't a question. It was a plea. "No one lives. No one has ever. I don't know." She covered his hands with her own. His skin was still cold. But not the killing cold of the night before. Something lesser. Something that might in time learn to be warm. Something broke in his face then. The mask he wore, the cold king's mask, the one that kept the whole world at arm's length, it cracked straight down the middle. And behind it she saw a man who had been alone so long he had forgotten what hope felt like in his own chest. He pulled her against him. Hard. His arms wrapped around her like iron bands, and she felt his breath come ragged against her hair, felt his heart pounding beneath her ear, too fast, too desperate, like a man who'd been running for years and had only just been allowed to stop. "I was so certain," he whispered. "When I woke, I didn't want to look. I was so certain you'd be cold beside me, like all the rest." "I'm warm," she said, "or as warm as I ever am." A sound escaped him. It might have been a laugh. It might have been a sob. She could not have said which, and she suspected he couldn't either. And outside the frosted window, unnoticed, the silver ferns of ice had melted clean away. The news ran through Valemore like fire through dry grass. The Winter King's 18th bride had lived. Servants whispered it in the corridors. Nobles demanded audiences, and the whole cold kingdom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to learn whether this was a miracle or only a tragedy that had not yet finished happening. Aloan became overnight the most watched woman in the north. Healers came at every meal to press their fingers to her wrist and count. Guards stood outside her door through every night listening for the sounds of distress that had always before come by now. And every morning she woke breathing the whole castle exhaled together as one great uncertain animal that could not quite believe its luck. 1 week passed, then 2, then a month, and still she lived. She had expected him to keep his distance once the contract was fulfilled. She had proven herself immune a curiosity, a puzzle to be studied, and then perhaps shelved. She had not expected him to want a wife, a companion, a queen. But every evening he came to her chambers. The first time he stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back, stiff as a soldier at inspection. "I wish to inquire after your health," he said. She invited him in. They talked for hours, about nothing at first, and then somehow about everything. About his childhood in a castle where his own parents flinched from touching him, where a nursemaid had once wept openly at being asked to hold his hand. About her own girlhood in a house that had looked at her hollowness and called it shame. About the loneliness they both wore like a second skin so long that they had stopped noticing its weight. The second evening he brought her a book from his private library. "You mentioned you liked histories," he said, and could not quite meet her eyes. The third evening he stayed for supper, and by the second week it had become a thing with a shape to it, a ritual. They would dine together. They would speak of the kingdom of small matters and large. They would read by the fire, sometimes trading pages, sometimes simply sitting in the same warm silence. Two lonely people who had each forgotten what it felt like to be in the company of someone who did not fear them. And every night without fail he would eventually reach for her, because the thing between them had changed. What had begun as careful, frightened experiment had become something else, something that had no name yet, but wanted one. She learned that her touch truly warmed him, that the frost pulled back wherever her skin found his. He learned that his cold did not drain her, but filled her instead, gave sensation back to a woman who had felt nothing for years. They were a paradox. A pair of curses that laid side by side canceled each other clean. "I feel things," she admitted one night lying in the circle of his arms. "When I'm with you. Warmth, wanting, a kind of quiet. I hadn't felt anything in so long I'd forgotten there was anything to feel." His hand went still on her back. "Is that good?" he asked. "I think so." She tilted her head to look at him. "Though my sister's warning keeps ringing in my ears. Marin warned you about me. She said the curse feeds on love, that the women who cared for you died fastest." I was quiet a long time. "She isn't wrong," he said finally. "The ones who felt nothing lasted longest, a full night sometimes. And the ones who looked at me with tenderness," his voice caught on the word, "they were gone within hours." "Then I should stay hollow," she said. "Stay cold, keep you at arm's length." "Yes." His arm tightened around her. "That would be the wise thing." Neither of them moved apart. She should have listened. That was the thing she would come back to later in the dark. She should have listened to her own good sense, to Marin's frightened eyes, to the 17 graves in the royal ground. She should have kept the door of her heart bolted shut. But you cannot bolt a door that is already opening, because it was opening. Day by day, evening by evening, a thing she'd thought sealed forever was creaking open in her chest, and she was helpless to stop it. She noticed it in small ways. The way her breath caught when his footsteps came down the corridor. The way the room felt wrong when he wasn't in it. The way she found herself in the long, empty afternoons thinking of things she wanted to tell him. And then one morning she woke before he did, and she looked at his sleeping face, and her chest simply ached with the fullness of it, and she understood. She was falling in love with him. Despite every warning, despite every grave, despite the plain and murderous arithmetic that said a woman who loved the Winter King did not live to grow old. She lay very still and thought, "I have to stop this," and knew even as she thought it that she couldn't. Maren came to visit once in that second month. She found Elowen in the eastern solar, and for a while they simply sat two sisters who did not quite know how to be sisters drinking tea gone cold. And then Maren set down her cup and folded her hands and said the thing she had come to say. I have to tell you something about our mother. Elowen went still. They did not speak of their mother, had not for the whole of their lives. Their mother was a fever that had taken her when Elowen was small. That was the story, the only story, the one their father allowed. You were too young to remember her, Maren said. Her voice had gone strange and thin. But I wasn't. I remember her hands. I remember she was warm, always warm even in the deep of winter. And I remember... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I remember she could do things, small things. She'd hold a cup of water and it would steam. She'd touch a wilting flower and it would stand back up. I thought everyone's mother could do that. I was a child. I didn't know it was magic, Elowen breathed. Maren nodded once her eyes bright with something that had waited a very long time to be said. She was a fire witch, Maren whispered. From an old line, healers the stories said, women who could mend any wound, cure any sickness, thaw any frozen thing. Her hands were trembling now. And Father didn't die of grief when she passed Elowen. He didn't grieve at all, because Father is the one who... She couldn't finish it. She didn't have to. The room seemed to tilt around Elowen, slowly, like a ship taking on water. He had her killed, Elowen said, flat, numb, the words coming out of the hollow place, because of what she was, because he was afraid of what she was. Maren's tears spilled over at last. And then when you were small, when you started showing the same warmth, the same little wonders. She reached across the table and gripped Elowen's hand. He had you sealed. That's what the mark is. That's what the hollow is. It isn't a sickness, sister. It never was. It's a lock. He locked you away inside yourself so no one would ever know what runs in your blood. Elowen looked down at her own hand, at her sister's fingers wrapped around it, at the ring on her finger, his mother's ring, with its slow swirling frost. Fire witch, sealed, hollowed, not broken by an accident of birth, but hollowed on purpose, by her own father, who had looked at a child showing signs of warmth and decided the safest thing was to empty her out. She waited for the rage, and this time, for the first time in years, it came. Faint, distant, but real. A small ember glowing to life in a hearth that had been cold so long she'd forgotten it was a hearth at all. She was not empty because she was worthless. She had been emptied because she was dangerous. There was a difference, and that difference she understood was going to change everything. She told him that night. She told Kaelin everything Maren had said, the fire witch, the murder, the seal her own father had paid to have carved into her chest. She watched his face as she spoke, watched the old cold fury gather in his winter eyes at the thought of a father who would do such a thing to his child. And when she had finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he took her hand, and he pressed his cold lips to the hollow mark over her heart, the way he had that first night. And she gasped, because something answered. Deep beneath the seal in the locked and buried place, something turned over in its sleep. Then we truly are matched, he murmured against her skin. You made to hold fire, me cursed to spread ice. Perhaps that was never a curse at all between the two of us. Perhaps only two halves of a whole waiting a very long time to find each other. She wanted to believe that. She wanted more than she had wanted anything in years to believe that two broken people could be the cure for each other's breaking. And that, of course, was exactly when it all fell apart. It happened 3 nights later. They had dined together as they always did. They had read by the fire. And then he had set down his book and looked at her across the small, warm space between them. And something had shifted in his face. Something soft. Something undefended. Something she had never once seen on the face of the Winter King. Elowen, he said, I need to tell you something. And I've never said it before, to anyone. So forgive me if I say it badly. Her heart began to pound. I've been alone my whole life, he said. Even before the curse, Even as a boy, I was the thing people flinched from, the cold prince, the monster in the making. He swallowed. And I made my peace with it. I decided a very long time ago that I would die the way I'd lived, alone, the last of a frozen line. Kalen, let me finish, please, before I lose the nerve. His hands were trembling. Because you looked at me without fear. The first person in my life who ever did. And every evening you let me sit by your fire and read your histories and hold your hand as though it didn't cost you anything to hold it. And somewhere in these weeks I stopped being a king performing a marriage. His voice dropped to almost nothing. And I became a man who loves his wife. The fire cracked in the hearth, and Elowen felt her whole chest fill with a warmth so bright and so total that for one instant she thought she might weep, she who had not wept in years. I love you too, she said. I've been so afraid to say it. Marin told me it would kill me. But I can't. I can't hold it back anymore. I love you, and I don't care what it costs. She got no further, because the joy drained out of his face all at once, like color from a corpse. No, he whispered. Kalen. No, no, Eloan, you can't. He was on his feet now, backing away, his hands coming up as if to ward off her words. You don't understand. The curse doesn't only kill women who love me. Then what? It kills me too. The room went silent, even the fire seemed to hush. Why do you think I never let anyone close? His voice was breaking apart in his throat. Why I was so terrified of caring for any of them. The curse was made to be sure I never found happiness. It's not a sickness, it's a sentence. Passed down my whole line because my ancestors. He stopped. His face had gone the color of ash. Because my ancestors burned witches, Elowen, healers, fire witches, women exactly like your mother. They put them to the flame, whole generations of them, and one of those dying women cursed my house with her last breath, that the cold we brought would turn on us, that the moment any of us found love, true love, love returned, it would take everything, the woman we loved, and then us. The words landed on her one by one like stones dropped into deep water. Fire witches, burned by his blood, cursed by a dying witch. And her mother had been one of them, one of that hunted, murdered line. That's why the ring stone is moving, she whispered, staring at the frost swirling on her finger. That's why it woke when you gave it to me. I don't know what it means, he said. I only know that if you love me, if I love you back, if that love is true and shared and real. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Because it had already begun. She watched it happen, and it was the most terrible thing she had ever seen. Frost, real frost, thick and white and creeping, spread out from the center of his chest, blooming through the black fabric of his shirt. His skin went pale, then paler still than a blue-white she had only ever seen on the dead. His eyes went wide with a sudden tearing pain. No, she said. No, not yet. I only just told you. The curse has been waiting. He gasped it out, clutching at his chest, his legs beginning to fold beneath him. Every night, every evening by the fire, every time I touched you and let myself be happy, it was all feeding it, building it, waiting for this, for the moment I finally, then I take it back. She was on her knees beside him now, her hands on his frozen shoulders, the ember in her chest flaring into terror. I don't love you. Do you hear me? I feel nothing. I'm hollow. I'm empty. I'm still. You can't take back the truth. His hand found hers. His grip was weakening. And I can't take back what I've felt for months. I love you, Eloan. I have loved you since you looked at me without fear. The frost spread faster. It climbed his throat. His breath came out white and thinning. Help! She was screaming now, screaming into the empty chamber, the empty castle, the empty night. Someone help me. The king is dying. The doors burst open. Guards spilled into the room and stopped short, every one of them, at the sight before them. The Winter King, down on the floor, wrapped in his own frost, dying in the arms of the wife who had done the one thing no bride before her had ever survived long enough to do. She had loved him, and it was killing them both. There's no cure, he breathed. His eyes were already dimming the gray, going pale as the winter sky at dusk. I'm sorry, my love. I'm so sorry. I should never have let myself. The frost reached his face. His eyes fluttered closed. And Eloan hollow sealed emptied. Eloan threw back her head in that cold and silent chamber and screamed as though the sound might tear the curse straight out of the world. It didn't. Of course it didn't. But somewhere deep beneath the hollow mark in the locked room her father had built inside her chest, something had heard her. And it was beginning at last to wake. The court physician shook his head slowly, and his face was the face of a man who has run out of things to try. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. There is nothing medicine can do. What ails the king is not of the body, it is magic. And magic requires a practitioner of the old arts, the very thing outlawed in this kingdom, for 300 years. Eloan stood over Kalen's frozen form. 3 days had passed since he fell. 3 days of watching the frost creep across him like slow white moss. 3 days of pressing her palm to his chest and feeling beneath the layer of ice, the faintest flicker of warmth still buried there, smaller each hour, dimmer each dawn. He was still alive, barely, the way an ember is still alive under an inch of ash. But he was going, and medicine had nothing left to offer. Then find me a practitioner, she said. Find me anyone who can help him. Magic is forbidden, Your Majesty, has been for generations. Any witch strong enough to touch a curse like this would have fled Valemore long ago. Or burned. Burned. The words sat in the cold air between them. Because that was the whole of it, wasn't it? That was the wound at the root of everything. His ancestors had burned the healers, and the healers had cursed the house, and now the house was dying by the very fire it had refused to let live. And her mother had been one of those healers, and her mother had been murdered too. And somewhere in her own sealed chest ran the same hunted blood. Then I'll find one myself, Elowen said. She rode out that same afternoon, against the protests of the council, against the warnings of the guard, against every reasonable voice that told her a queen did not ride alone into the wild north with her king dying behind her. The only one who did not try to stop her was Marin. Marin, who appeared at the stables as Elowen tightened the girth, her golden hair wild in the wind, her face set with something Elowen had never seen on it before. Resolve. There's a woman, Marin said, in the northern woods, past the old border. They call her Mother Isolde. She pressed a folded scrap of parchment into Elowen's hand, a map drawn in a hurried, shaking line. She deals in curses, and the unmaking of them. How do you know this? Because father consulted her once. Marin's jaw tightened. Years ago. About you. Elowen's blood went cold. Go, Marin said before she could ask. Save your king, and when you come back... Her voice wavered. There are things you still don't know. Things father buried deep. Things I should have told you years ago and didn't because I was a coward. But go first. Ride. There isn't time. Elowen swung up into the saddle and rode north into the trees toward whatever waited. She found the cottage after 3 hard days of riding deep in a forest, where the pines grew so close together they swallowed the sun. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney, and the woman who opened the door was older than anyone Elowen had ever seen her face, a whole landscape of lines, her eyes gone milk-white and blind. But her voice when it came was sharp as a drawn blade. The Queen of Valemore, the old woman said. I wondered how long it would take you to come to me. You know who I am. I know what you carry. The blind eyes fixed impossibly on the center of Elowen's chest, on the hollow mark hidden beneath layers of cloth. I put it there after all. The whole forest seemed to go silent. Come inside, child, said Mother Weisold. We have a great deal to unbury. The cottage was crowded with the debris of a long, strange life. Bundles of dried herbs, jars of things Elowen did not want to name. Small pale bones hung from the rafters like wind chimes that made no sound. The old woman lowered herself into a chair by the fire and gestured for Elowen to sit. Your father came to me when you were 7 years old, Isolde began. You had begun to show the gift. Strong it was. Stronger than your mother's, perhaps. Fire and warmth and living things bending toward your small hands. And he was afraid of it. So very afraid. So he had you seal it, Elowen said, bitterly. He had you carve the hollow into me and empty me out so no one would ever know what I was, so he could hide his shame. Mother Isolde was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, a dry rustling sound like leaves skittering across stone. Is that the story you've been telling yourself? She said. That the seal was your father's cruelty? Wasn't it, no child? The old woman leaned forward and the firelight carved her ancient face into something almost gentle. The seal was your mother's mercy. The world tilted. You said, Elowen's voice came out thin. You said you put it there, after my father came to you. Your father came to me demanding I destroy the gift, burn it out of you, kill whatever it was in your blood that reminded him of the wife he'd murdered. Isolde's blind eyes glittered. I refused, so he came a second time, and this time your mother came with him. My mother was already... Elowen stopped. My mother was dead by then. Was she? The old woman said it softly. Is that the story too? Elowen could not speak. Your mother knew what your father was, Isolde went on. She knew the moment you were born warm that he would come for you the way he'd come for her. A fire witch raising a fire witch daughter in the house of a man who hunted them. So she made a choice, the hardest choice a mother can make. The old woman's voice dropped. She let the world believe she had died. She let your father believe he had won. And in secret she came to me the last night of her life as your mother and she begged me to seal you. To hollow me, Elowen whispered. To take everything out of me. To hide you. Isolde shook her head slowly. Do you understand a witch child unsealed in that house would have been discovered within a year? And discovered you would have burned the way they burned all the others. So your mother had me build a lock, not to empty you to protect what was inside you, to make you look broken so the men who burned the whole and the beautiful would pass you by. Her ancient hand reached out and found Elowen's and held it. The hollow was never your cursed child. It was the shell your mother built around the ember, so that one day when you were strong enough when it was finally safe the fire could wake. Elowen sat very still by the fire, and felt something she had not felt in the whole of her remembered life. She had been loved. Before the coldness, before the emptiness, before the father who called her damaged goods, a woman had held her and known what the world would do to her and given up her own place in her daughter's life to keep her alive. The hollow she had carried in shame all these years was not a mark of worthlessness at all. It was a mother's arms closed around her all this time. Then break it, Elowen said. Her voice shook. Break the seal. Wake the fire. My husband is dying and I have the one thing in all the world that can save him, and it's locked inside my own chest. So break the lock, please. I'll pay anything. But Mother Isolde only shook her head. I cannot. You made it. You can... I made the lock, child, but I did not make the key. The old woman's blind gaze held her. There is no token, no word, no potion. Your father believed there was. He thinks to this day that he holds some trinket that controls you, and he holds nothing. Because the seal your mother asked for was a seal that only you could open. A lock that answers to one thing and one thing only. What? Elowen breathed. Tell me, what opens it? Love that is not afraid of its own cost. The fire popped in the grate. The seal is fear made solid, Isolde said. Your mother built it from a mother's fear, the fear that kept you small and safe and hidden. And fear can only be undone by its opposite, not the absence of fear, the overcoming of it. You must love something so completely that you are willing to be destroyed for it, not hope to survive, not bargain for a happy ending. You must walk toward the fire knowing it may take everything and love anyway. And Elowen understood, because that was the very thing she had been running from her whole life. She had let herself be hollow because hollow was safe. She had told herself she felt nothing because nothing could not be hurt. Even in that frozen chamber, even loving Kaelin, some deep locked part of her had held back, had kept one foot outside the fire, some small cold corner of herself in reserve, in case it all went wrong. The seal would not break for a woman who loved carefully. It would break only for a woman who loved with everything and kept nothing back and was not afraid to burn. Go home, child, said Mother Isolde softly. Go home to your dying king. And when you kneel beside him, do not hold back. Not 1 inch of yourself. That is the key. That is the only key there has ever been. She rode back faster than she had come, because there was no time. Because every hour she spent in that forest was an hour the frost climbed higher on the man she loved. She rode until her horse foundered, and she took another. She rode through nights she should have slept, and dawns she did not see. And the whole way one truth burned in her chest, like a coal she could not set down. She had been loved. She had been worth saving. She had never once been damaged goods. But there was a stop she had to make first. Because Marin had said it. There are things you still don't know. And Elowyn would not walk back into that castle carrying half a truth. So she rode not to Valemore, but to the Corrin estate, to the house of the father who had called her worthless and sold her to a grave. The great doors did not slow her. She walked into the hall where Lord Aldrich sat at supper, and every guard in the room fell back before her, because she was the Queen of Valemore now, and because something in her face told them not to test it. Her father looked up. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Beside him Marin rose slowly from her chair. Elowyn. Her father's voice dripped its old contempt. I heard the king was dying. Come to beg. No, she said. I came to look at you. She crossed the hall, slow, unhurried, and she watched him the way you watch a thing you have finally after a lifetime stopped being afraid of. I know everything, she said. About Mother, about the seal, about the witch you thought you'd bought. You thought you held a key to me, didn't you? A trinket, a leash. She let herself smile small and cold and free. You never held anything. There was never any key but the one inside my own chest. You spent my whole life believing you'd caged me, and you never held the door shut at all. His face began to change, the contempt curdling into something else, something she had waited her whole life to see there. Fear. You had her killed, Elowyn said. Your own wife, because she was warm and you couldn't bear a thing you didn't understand. And then you looked at her child at me, and you decided the safest thing was to empty me out and call it mercy. I protected this family. His voice rose cracking at the edges. You have no idea what she was, what you are. I did what any reasonable man. You did what a frightened man does, Elowyn said. You met something you didn't understand, and instead of learning it, you tried to kill it. Her, me. And it made you smaller every year you did it until this is all that's left of you. She looked at him, truly, looked at the shrunken, shaking old man behind the table. You didn't protect anyone, Father. You only taught yourself over and over that the answer to fear is fire. And now the man I love is dying of a curse your own kind lit 300 years ago. Isn't that a thing? Isn't that just a thing? Marin was weeping now, silently, her hand pressed to her mouth, and Lord Aldrich, cornered, exposed, stripped of the last of his mask, did what such men always do. He reached for a knife. It happened fast. He lunged not at Elowyn but past her toward Marin, toward the daughter who had betrayed him by telling the truth, and Elowyn saw the blade catch the candlelight, saw her sister's eyes go wide, saw the whole terrible arithmetic of the moment laid out in a single frozen instant. And she did not think. She moved. She threw herself between the knife and her sister, and the blade meant for Marin's heart went into Elowyn's shoulder instead, and the pain of it was white and enormous and real, and something in her chest cracked open. Because here it was, the very thing Isolde had spoken of. Love that does not count the cost. She had not calculated. She had not held back one cold corner of herself in reserve. She had seen her sister, the sister who had wronged her, the sister she had every reason to let fall, and she had thrown her whole self into the path of the blade without a single thought for what it might take from her. She had loved with everything, and kept nothing back. The seal shattered. Fire exploded through her veins, not burning but blazing, roaring up from the locked room in her chest and out through every inch of her at once. The hollow mark over her heart cracked and split and dissolved into light. Flame danced along her skin. The guards fell back with cries. The candles in the hall flared to towers. And Lord Aldrich stumbled away from his daughter, from both his daughters, his face lit gold and terrible by the fire of the child he had spent his whole life trying to snuff out. Impossible, he breathed. No, Elowen said, and her voice rang with something that was no longer only hers, the voice of her mother, and her mother's mother, and every warm and hunted woman his kind had ever put to the flame. Just late. The blade fell from her shoulder. The wound sealed itself in light. Guards seized Lord Aldrich before he could run. He would answer to the crown now for the murder of his wife and the crimes against his child, and Elowen did not stay to watch them take him. Because there was no time. Because there had never been any time. She turned to Marin whole alive, staring at her sister wreathed in impossible fire, and she said only, "Live, I'll come back for you." And then she was gone out into the night, blazing like a fallen star riding for Valemore, and the man she had left dying in the ice. She burst into his chamber to find them pulling a sheet over his face. No. She crossed the room and shoved the physicians aside and tore the linen away. He's not dead, he can't be. Kalen lay beneath it, his whole body sheathed in white frost, his chest still his lips, the blue of deep water. He looked like a thing carved from a glacier, a statue of the man she loved. But she pressed her burning hand to his chest, and felt it. Deep, deep beneath the ice, one last ember. Guttering. Nearly out. But there. Everyone out, she said. They fled. She climbed onto the bed. She pressed both flaming hands flat against his heart, and she bent her head close to his ruined blue face, and she stopped holding back. All of it. Every year of it. The lonely child, the hollow girl, the bride who walked toward a grave without flinching, the woman who had learned in a cold castle what it was to be warm. She let the fire pour out of her and down into him, and she did not save a single spark for herself. "I love you," she whispered against his frozen lips, "and I am not afraid anymore. Do you hear me? Not of the curse, not of the cost, not of losing you or losing myself. I love you with all of it, every last piece, and I am not holding back one breath." The frost began to melt. It ran off him in rivulets hissing into steam. The blue left his lips. Color crept back into his skin, faint at first, then stronger, the flush of blood, of warmth, of life, returning to a body that had all but let it go. But the curse fought her. She felt it, a thing ancient and dark and starving, clinging to his heart with frozen claws. It had fed for 300 years on loneliness and grief, on frozen bride after frozen bride, and it did not intend to let this one go. It reached for her fire to smother it, and found it could not, because her fire was older still. The fire of the healers his kind had burned, the fire of the very women whose murder had lit this curse in the first place. And that fire had not come to fight. It had come to do the one thing his line had refused 3 centuries ago to let it do. It had come to heal. She burned brighter, brighter than she had known she could. She poured her mother's gift, and her mother's love, and her own whole undefended heart into the ice around his soul, and the curse screamed a sound only she could hear, the last cry of every witch who had ever wept in the flames, and then at last it broke. The ice was gone. The cold was gone. And Kalen drew a great gasping living breath. His eyes flew open, gray, clear, and warm, warm as a hearth, warm as summer, warm as she had never once seen them. Elowen. Her name came out rough and broken. "What did you—" She kissed him before he could finish, and his lips were warm. For the first time since she had known him, the Winter King's lips were warm against hers. "The curse is broken," she whispered. "It's over. You're free." He pulled her against him, his arms strong and living around her, and she felt his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her ear, no longer slowed by ice. "How?" he breathed. "I stopped being afraid," she said, and she laughed and wept both at once. That was all it ever needed, all this time, someone who wasn't afraid to burn for you. 2 years later, the Queen of Valemore stood in a sunlit garden, watching her daughter take her first wobbling steps across the grass. Little Lyra had her father's dark hair and her mother's amber eyes. She had also, it was becoming clear, inherited her mother's fire, which she had lately demonstrated by setting her own blanket cheerfully ablaze whenever she was cross. The nursemaids had learned to keep a bucket close. She's getting faster, said Kalen, coming up beside her and sliding an arm around her waist. His skin was warm. It had been warm every single day since the curse broke, and he still marveled at it sometimes, pressing his own hand to his own cheek as if to be sure. She's going to be a terror, Elowen said fondly. I would not have her any other way. Across the garden, Marin sat reading on a bench in the sun. She had come to live at the castle after their father's trial. Lord Aldrich, now grown old in a cell, stripped of his lands and titles, left to spend his last years answering for what he'd done. The two sisters were still learning how to be sisters. It was slow work, but it was at last honest work. Marin looked up, caught Elowen's eye, and smiled. A servant approached with a bow. Your Majesty, the council waits for the signing. Kalen nodded. Will come. Because today they would sign the last of it into law. An end to 300 years of hunting. Witches who had hidden their whole lives, healers, seers, keepers of the old warm arts, would be free at last to live in the open, to be seen, to not be burned. You're changing everything, Elowen said as they walked toward the castle. My ancestors made a curse that froze this house for centuries because they were too frightened to let one kind of warmth exist. He shrugged. I think it's time somebody let it in. Behind them, Lyra shrieked with delight as a butterfly landed on her nose and promptly caught very gently on fire. The nursemaid sighed and reached for the bucket. They had said no woman would last a night with him. They had counted his brides and dug his graves and taught their children the terrible number of the dead. But they had been wrong about all of it. Because they had measured a woman's worth in her beauty and her bloodline, and they had looked at a hollow, silent, unwanted girl and seen nothing there worth saving. They had never understood that the hollow was not emptiness. It was a mother's arms. It was a locked door. It was a fire waiting patient as winter for someone brave enough to stop being afraid. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered. But one woman lasted a lifetime, and she had never, not for a single day, been broken at all.